Put up live video.
One minute,
Okay.
6 seconds.
I think we may be live, Andrew, but I'm not sure. Let's just
According
wait
to Facebook, it's 52 seconds.
Okay, well, let's, just in case we are live, let's be careful what we say here for 52
All right.
seconds.
Go Oilers, go. No, just
There you go. Okay, we are live, I think, according to my sources. So I'll take their word for it. So those of you watching us live on Facebook, first of all, thank you very much. I started during the darkest days of the pandemic doing Facebook Live discussions with notable individuals and people in my riding and around the country on a whole variety of issues, ostensibly at the time to stay in touch with my community and keep them informed about events at the time. But we've continued this tradition after the fact, and tonight this is the first one I've done in a little while, but I am very thrilled to be joined by Andrew Weaver, who probably needs no introduction. Andrew was an MLA in British Columbia for a number of years. You have a resume that's far too long, Andrew, because we've only got about half an hour here. But we're here to talk about environment, climate change, the green economy. And for those of you who are listening, there is nobody better to talk to about this, perhaps, than Andrew Weaver. And Andrew, I'm really, really thrilled that you're able to join me tonight. So thank you, first of all.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk about the thing I love so dear in my life is climate solutions, because they're all out there before us, and the more we talk about it, the more rapidly they get put in place.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's a topic on the forefront of everybody's mind, no matter who you are or what your views are. And I should mention, by the way, this coming Saturday is Earth Day. Those of you who are listening, you probably know that already. It's a significant day. But look, why don't we start with basics here, Andrew? Tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us how you got involved and became so interested in climate change. Just tell us a little bit about your story, perhaps.
Yeah, okay, sure. So I graduated from high school and then undergraduates focusing on physics and math. I graduated from high school and then university undergraduate focusing on physics and maths. And we're having some recording issues here, I get it. Anyway, so as I mentioned, I started out as in physics and math, and I initially thought I was going to go into the area of particle physics, theoretical particle physics. A lot of people in the 1980s, a lot of the big questions in physics were revolving around particle physics, and that's what people did. And I went to do graduate work in particle physics. While I was there, I had the opportunity to take some courses in fluid mechanics from some of the world's most famous names at Cambridge, people like George Batchelor and Michael Longat-Higgins. I had the pleasure of literally tripping over Stephen Hawking while he was about to give a lecture as well. So I mean, I got surrounded by these amazing physicists doing some really exciting work and work on the environmental issues, fluid mechanics, ocean flow, airflow. And I got interested there and switched to that because I felt that, particle physics at the time was getting a lot of its funding from defense research. And I didn't really feel quite good about that. Whereas ocean physics, atmospheric physics, climate physics is really physics in service of society. It's addressing questions that people care about and affect their daily lives. So I got in, started as faculty at McGill in 1989, worked as a lead author on numerous IPCC reports from 95, 2001, 2007, 2013. These are the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports. I've served on a multitude of international committees, chief editor of Journal of Climate. I published a bajillion papers on climate, well, not really, a couple hundred on climate science. And around 2013, well, actually slightly before that, in 2012, I was approached by Jane Sturt, who was at the time the leader of the BC Green Party, a very centrist, very a person I had a lot of respect for. And she asked if I would run, and it was the fourth time she asked me that I finally said yes. And the reason why I did was not because I had this grand ambition of spending the rest of my life in politics, but because I believe that the barriers to climate action, that is the introduction of climate solutions, were no longer the existence of those solutions, but rather were political will. And I felt, having taught at the university for many, many years, decades, in fact, it was really time to put up or shut up, because there's nothing that really bothered me more than a bunch of academics telling everyone else what to do, but not really willing to follow that themselves. And so I thought, okay, I've been lecturing about the importance of casting a vote, the importance of youth getting involved in our democratic institutions. They would tell me, well, there's no one to vote for, and I would tell them, well, then run yourself or find someone to run. And it came to a time that I thought, okay, I really should do this. And so I ran with the BC Green Party, a party that never elected anyone in any province ever before, mainly initially to raise the dialogue and the discourse on climate policy. And it resonated with people, because the message I focused on was not a message of doom and fear, but was focused on the opportunity that dealing with global warming and climate change actually presents itself. And those jurisdictions that position themselves as leaders in dealing with these problems have an awful lot to benefit, both from their prosperity as well as through their credibility on the international scene. And I haven't regretted going into the politics. I did 2 terms, and then we introduced our Clean BC, which was my goal. And after Clean BC, our economic plan here in British Columbia, grounded in clean tech, etc., I stepped aside, and I'm back at university now, focusing on climate solutions. So that's my story.
Well, that's part of your story. You're being very modest, of course, but I'm glad you switched the topic from particle physics, because if you'd carried on there, you would have lost me completely, and this segment would be a lot shorter than it would be otherwise. So, look, 1989, and there's been an evolution of thinking and of people and public opinion on climate change. I mean, you talked about global warming versus climate change.
Yeah.
I used to. Back in 1989, I don't know that there was an appetite for, there was an acceptance by people for government sort of addressing this or doing something about it. There was an evolution of people sort of accept it's real, and then they would sort of accept that government should be doing something about it. And then it got to a point where people were willing to accept the fact that something should be done about it as long as it didn't affect them. I think we're well beyond that now. And it's true, because people talk a good game, but then when it comes to pocketbook or making significant changes in lifestyle or habits, people are a little bit reluctant, and that's human nature. I understand that. But so you were the very first. Well, let's talk about that. I mean, that because the global warming isn't terminology that people use anymore. We've now moved on to climate change.
I've always used that term. It's actually interesting, the whole evolution of that. The evolution in public discourse from global warming to climate change actually has its roots in a memo by Frank Lutz to the US Republican Party at the time when George Bush Sr. was in power. There was some concerns about the language that the US government was using. And that now famous memo pointed out that if you use the words global warming, it can be viewed as more threatening than if you use the word climate change. And so the recommendation was a shift in public discourse coming out of the US to using climate change as opposed to global warming. I've always focused on the term global warming. And the reason why is because climate always changes. And when you use the words climate change, you set yourself up for people saying, well, climate has always changed. Winter's colder than summer. Climate changes, right? So whereas what we're really talking about is the warming of the planet as a direct consequence of the increased atmospheric loading of greenhouse gases, largely associated with the combustion of fossil fuels. It's a very specific problem with a very specific source. And when we start to muddy where the problem and source comes from, we start to get distracted from what the solutions are. The solutions are very simple as well. Transforming energy systems from polluting to non-polluting. And I know that people will say, oh, it's impossible. But in fact, we could do that tomorrow if there was a will. Obviously, of course, there isn't yet. We still have Japan as early as this past weekend in the ministers' G7 meeting, issuing words like we're still working on clean coal, right? I mean, as soon as you use clean coal, you start to question things. Anyway, so I have typically focused on the term global warming. I know others don't, but that's why I did.
Well, you're right, because you get into these dialogue with the skeptics and you say climate change, and they say, well, climate's changed over generations, over centuries, and this is just normal patterns, but it's not. I mean,
No, of course not.
fortunately, those people are becoming fewer and fewer and fewer all the time, but they still exist. All right, let me talk about.
Well, those people are. If I could just address some of these people, because it's actually an important point. Is one of the successes we had in BC in advancing climate policy, as I'm seeing you have federally as well, is recognizing that when you start to talk about long-term future projections of climate, you're starting to run up against tensions about faith-based belief systems. You start to run into tensions with vested interests, and it's a natural human reaction to kind of not want to admit that you're doing something that's having a negative effect on everyone around you. You might appeal to your faith. You might appeal to the fact that everyone else is doing it. But the reality is, there is broad societal engagement. We know from poll after poll after poll in the G7, G20 nations, upwards of 80% of people want governments to do something. So we're way past now the point where we have to argue about the importance of doing something. It's now about advancing those solutions.
Yeah, I'm eternally optimistic. I like to think on a lot of political issues, but this one in particular, that everybody's heading in the same direction. They're just going faster or slower than the person beside them and taking a slightly different route. And then you throw politics into the mix, and it gets a little bit nasty and ugly, and people get thrown off the point, which I guess is the idea. So, look, I mean, there's all kinds of challenges, but let's talk about carbon pricing, for example. I mean, this is something that we introduced federally back in 2016. It's been a hot subject in the 2019 election, again in the 2021 election. It continues to be a hot button item. There are still lots of skeptics that is not the way to move forward of trying to reduce carbon. Tell the listeners here in very basic terms why it makes sense to you.
Okay. First off, you don't solve the climate change or the global warming problem with one policy. You require,
right,
as you know, myriad policies. But the most important one is the signal you send to the market that it is no longer okay to use the atmosphere as an unregulated dumping ground for your trash. So what we are basically saying, we have said historically, is that while in every other aspect of our daily lives, we have to pay to throw something away. For example, we have municipal fees to pick up the garbage at our homes and take it to the dump. We just seem to think that for whatever reason, we can use the atmosphere to put whatever we want in it, and there's no cost to that. We're not allowed to do that in the oceans. We're not allowed to throw garbage on our streets, but it's okay to do that in the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is very thin, and we all breathe it. So the single most important policy you can do is to price emissions, because without emissions pricing, it is in every person, in every household, in every municipality, in every town, in every city, in every province, in every country, in the world's best interest to do nothing, because any costs of action are borne by the individual, and any costs of inaction are distributed amongst 8 billion people in future generations, right? So you basically are not internalizing the so-called, in the language of economics, you're not internalizing the externalities associated with your behavior. We force, for example, industry to clean up their pollution in every other aspect. We have government regulations in terms of acid rain. That was an environmental issue that we solved. A lot of that came through the regulatory approach, and what we're doing, we're not pricing methane. The regulatory approach has been working for methane, but the issue with carbon pricing is critical. And now the question then comes: Because if you put a price on emissions, it's saying we don't want you to pollute. And if you actually send a signal to the market by having it raise year by year, it allows for long-term business certainty, and it allows for long-term investment, and it sends the signal to the market at the direction our economy is heading. And what it's doing is saying we want to compete with the rest of the world. You know, we just have to look at the foolishness of what's been going on, and I say this with respect to my friends in Alberta, to the outrageous Alberta approach to resource development. I mean, Peter Lougheed is turning over in his grave every day. Yeah. From the many years where they established a heritage fund to position themselves for the future, like Norway has done and still is. But now we're seeming to think that we need to prop up of yesterday's technologies, whereas the pricing allows for a leveling of that playing field, allowing for the non-polluting industries to compete. And the final thing you have to do is say, what's going to happen to that money that comes in from government? And therein lies the beauty of the federal approach, which is also what we're doing here in BC, is you're bringing in the money through a levy, and you're giving it back out through a dividend. So you're protecting low-income people who aren't really part of the problem from the carbon pricing that they might have to pay. Well, you know, you might hear a fuss in Ontario. We don't have a fuss in BC about carbon pricing. It's just the cost of doing business in BC. And we had precisely zero pushback when we introduced, you know, pricing going up to the same $170 a ton in BC. And I was there when we were doing that. So it's just not an issue in BC.
So I live in Toronto. I've lived in Toronto for most of my life. I'm a member of Parliament from Toronto. What do I say to the guy who says, well, look, you know, my wife and I still have 3 cars. All I've seen is the price of gas go up. It hasn't modified my behavior. I look at my utility bills. In fact, I have friends actually who send me snapshots on their phone of their Enbridge bill, which shows the carbon price or the carbon amount on the bill, and saying this doesn't do any good. It's just another tax. I'm not changing. It's not forcing me to modify my behavior. All I'm doing is paying higher cost for the gas in my car and the heat in my home. What do I say to that? What do I say to that guy?
I would say that's a choice you've made, because that same price affects me. And when I look at that price, I don't care. I drive an electric vehicle. In fact, the price of gas, I haven't worried about that for over a decade. Now, people think, for example, that somehow electric vehicles are going to have range issues, or that they won't be able to drive them far and whatever. I mean, it's just, these are all fears that obviously they're real fears, people have them. But the second you drive an electric vehicle off the lot, you start saving money. So I don't know why anybody today in any urban area would want anything other than an electric vehicle, because you literally are saving money. Even if you know, when we, with the federal and provincial rebates, even, I mean, it may not work now. I haven't done the calculations since interest rates went up slightly, well, doubled recently. But when I bought my Leaf, I could go in and get a 100% financed car, 100% financed, drive it off the lot, and every month I'm saving money, because the amount I was paying on the interest for my Leaf was less than I would pay for the gasoline and for the maintenance. There's no moving parts, so there's no oil and filter, there's no radiator, so I spent nothing. So there's one thing for the gas. For the homes, I'd say, have you ever thought about a heat pump? And the reason why I say that is these are often, you know, and this is where there's a role for provincial governments. In BC, what we have now incentives that assist people with the implementation of heat pumps in their house. When heat pumps, of course, are good for the summer, where they can give you free cooling, as well as the winter, and they're more efficient than the traditional kind of combustion approach to producing heat. So there are other means and ways of doing that. And the third thing I would say is, how is your government, that is the government of Ontario, what are they doing with the carbon pricing? I don't know how Ontario and the federal government have worked out the pricing mechanisms. I know how it works in BC. But in BC here, you'd be getting a check back. You get about $1,000 back a year.
It's the same in Ontario.
Okay,
we get a rebate. Yeah.
Yeah. So most people who are lower income would get a rebate, and that rebate should, with the few exceptions, should largely be covering much of what they're paying in a carbon tax for the lower income people. I don't know the details in Ontario, and that's where I think people should continue to look, because it's essentially taxing polluter pay, where the polluter pays, and you can not pay if you don't pollute. Fine. And why it does change behavior, and it certainly has changed behavior in BC at least. But we brought in a zero emission vehicle mandate. Within 1 year, we've broken the 2025 target. So there's an appetite for change. Maybe the one person who's contacting you says it's not making them change. It's making an awful lot of other people change, because I don't want to be paying carbon tax. So what we can do in BC too, well, there's actually one more thing we can do in BC. You can switch to renewable natural gas in BC. I don't know whether you can do that out in Ontario yet, which is natural gas produced from agricultural waste. It's more expensive, but there's no carbon tax attached to that. And that's what I have done too.
So look, it is happening. I went to the auto show in Toronto about a month ago, and one of the things that stuck with me is one of the organizers said, 5 years ago, there was, not even 5 years ago, just a few years ago, if you went to the auto show, there was about, I forget the exact number, but it was a handful of electric vehicles available. Now there's 92.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a transition coming, which, leads to another point perhaps where, the some of the naysayers are saying, well, let the economy do this, it'll happen organically, it'll happen on its own. I think government's role is to sort of create an environment or a structure and navigate a system that helps people, nudge people along, because people sometimes need nudging and for a lot of reasons. But what about the other point that I hear so often, we all hear so often, is Canada is such a small part of the global problem. So why should we be paying such a big price here in Canada until the big emitters, India, China, etc., are doing their part? Because until they do it, global emissions aren't going to go down.
Well, first off, that argument doesn't actually hold water, and it's not true. The reason why I say that, Canada is, I believe, the 11th biggest emitter of all countries in the world on a straight total amount area. But more importantly, the atmosphere doesn't respond to the emissions in 1 year. The atmosphere cares about the cumulative emissions that we've put up since pre-industrial times. And so while we like to rail on India, whose population is about 34 times ours in Canada, since pre-industrial times, India and Canada have not put very much different amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. So India could turn to Canada and say, hang on, you've been doing this for 100 years. Sure, we're putting out more carbon this year than you are, and quite a bit more. But from a cumulative sense, which is how the atmosphere responds, we're pretty much the same. I think it's 1.8 times more in India than Canada. And so the other thing is, if everybody said that, we might as well just continue walking off a cliff and just say there's no hope.
And that's the argument I use, yeah.
Yeah, but we also know that those who show like this, I don't know what drives me crazy is that really, you ask the questions, when has the greatest leaps of innovation, creativity, and prosperity happened in human history? They've happened through major structural changes in things like the Industrial Revolution, or the onset of wireless technology, or the internet, transforming energy systems from polluting to non-polluting. While it may affect a few people working in the oil sands in northern Alberta, we can do so in a manner that is just, that assists in the transition of workers in traditional industries and assists them transition into other industries that don't pollute as much. Like, why wouldn't we want to do that? I mean, I just don't get it. Why would you want to continue to do something that pollutes? Like, why would you drive a V8 vehicle to pick your kids up at school and idle it in front of the school when you could drive an electric vehicle and there's no idling? Your kids don't need to breathe that smoke, right?
Okay, so I'm going to push back a little bit, only because this is the pushback we hear. So at a federal level, I mean, the steps we're taking, and I want to move this over to a federal level, because I'm sitting in the House of Commons. I sit next to somebody from Newfoundland. I sit next to somebody from New Brunswick. There's people from across the country. And when you start talking about electric vehicles and heat pumps, they're saying, well, that might work for you in Etobicoke, but that's not going to work for me in rural Saskatchewan or rural Alberta, because, it's too cold for a heat pump, and they're too expensive, and there's not enough charging infrastructure, because If I'm driving, it's different going to pick up your kids or go to the grocery store in Toronto, an electric vehicle. But if you're driving, in rural Saskatchewan or rural Manitoba or, any part of Canada, they don't have the charging infrastructure for vehicles. So what do I say to those people?
Well, first off, those people are not the problem. I mean, most of our people live in big cities. So sure, there may be a need for long haul transportation, and sure, there are alternate means of being developed. For example, we're going to see compressed natural gas, and I suspect it'll be compressed renewable natural gas play a bigger and more important role in the kind of rural transportation sector, in the long haul transportation sector. Really, we're not saying that you have to transition to zero carbon overnight. You obviously try to do the transition, but focusing in areas where it's not only cost effective, but it makes sense economically to do that. The city it makes sense economically for people to get out of their gas powered cars. And you get a co-benefit of health benefits from air quality, as well as the financial savings of your paying gas, et cetera. So, there are solutions that will be coming, and part of the pricing mechanism is to actually drive innovation. So if we have, for example, rural Saskatchewan, and the carbon pricing, and people are using, say, farm diesel, well, maybe, the carbon pricing on that is more than, say, compressed natural gas. So who knows, maybe there will be some innovation that's actually being driven by the pricing to actually transform some of these things into natural gas powered instead of diesel powered. I mean, this is how the pricing works, is it creates an opportunity for innovation to actually, because people want to save money. And those people who are willing to adopt the innovation will actually benefit. Of course, there will always be those people in society who just don't want to change. But unfortunately, not wanting to change is no longer an option, as very many people in the world are saying. And as you see our world polarize more and more into those people who don't want to do anything and those people who want a revolution to do everything, that's not a healthy situation. So I would suggest that it would be a far better if we realize that climate change is a very serious issue. The solution's all there. We need government to play leadership, because the role of government is actually to ensure that when I do business, I'm not affecting your ability to do business, i.e. to create a regulatory environment to ensure that the playing field is level. And the only way to do that on the climate is to start internalizing the externalities of using, an atmosphere as a trash can. We just can't do that. If we were putting, can you imagine if we were putting vast quantities of ammonia into the atmosphere? People die from ammonia. Just the thing with CO2 is it just takes longer for its effect to radiation to affect the Earth. But either way, we wouldn't tolerate polluting the air we breathe with other chemicals. I don't know why we think it's okay to put carbon dioxide at the levels we are into the atmosphere, unless there's this grand denial that somehow it doesn't have an effect, which is so far off base with science.
It is off base. You and I both know that. But part of the challenge is, if you go back to the example you used earlier about you pay a price for not recycling your garbage, you pay you pay a fine if you're dumping garbage or putting something but you can see and feel those things. People can't see carbon. So it's less tangible, and people don't get it. And if their life's not really changing, and they're just seeing increased costs, so it's a harder push than the
I
other
totally
example.
agree.
And
I totally agree.
I get that.
Yeah.
But on the other point you made about why we should do it if the big emitters don't, there's an economic opportunity here for Canada too.
100%. 100%.
Because the innovation, the desire to do this, the need to do this drives innovation. Canada's at the forefront of a lot. We're in the leading edge of a lot of technology. So when the bigger or other emitters come around, they're looking to Canada for solutions. That's the economic opportunity. I try to remind people that all the time. It falls on deaf ears in some circles, but it can't be understated, in my opinion, because Canada can be a leader.
Well, here's an example. Canada is well known internationally for its mining practices, right? Vancouver,
Right.
BC we are known to be leaders in mining around the world. Okay, so we're going to lose that if we don't recognize that around the world, people are moving away from no longer internalizing your externalities. It's not okay to go in and exploit people in a third world nation. It's not okay to tear apart a rainforest and start digging out the minerals. So where Canada can play an important role is recognizing that innovation in the mining sector, whether it be through more energy efficient mining, whether it be through better water use issues, whether it be through land reclamation, there's a huge opportunity to regain our international stature in mining, because we're still going to need mining, but to focus on doing it in manners that actually they're cleaner and more efficient. And I love the company in Vancouver. It's a small company called MineSense in Vancouver. It's a small company that developed some really innovative technology, right? It's to be able to determine whether at the rock face, whether the grade of that rock is such that it's economical to take it over to crush it up. I mean, huge savings can be done just with this little kind of innovation in terms of the being able to assay right at the bucket, in the bucket, right at the rock face. There are so many examples of this, and human ingenuity and creativity has met many challenges over the past. One of the most famous, of course, is the CFC problem, which is now solved, the ozone layer. Problem solved by international policy and innovation in that sector. There's no reason why we can't do that with climate change too.
I just came back from 3 days in Saskatchewan, speaking of mining. The purpose of the trip, for the most part, was to go out and visit a uranium mine. And the reason we went out to visit a uranium mine is because I'm a vocal advocate, along with many of my colleagues, of nuclear power. I mean, the demand for power is going to double by some accounts in about the next 25 years. We need a source for that power. We need clean energy, and nuclear energy seems to be the most viable solution. Do you agree with that, first of all?
So, look, here's the thing with nuclear energy. First off, a lot of people don't realize how much of it we have around the world. Secondly, a lot of, including Ontario, where you have an awful lot of it, and the reason why you got rid of your coal plants is because you got your nuclear power there as well.
100%.
And so a lot of people also don't recognize that because of things like 3 Mile Island a long time ago, society moved away from research and development in the nuclear fission space. We really have a bunch of Cold War era nuclear reactors still running around the place, which were designed with specific purposes of producing bomb-grade plutonium at a time when we were building lots of nuclear bombs. Technology has moved on from then. A lot of these older reactors would not be built today. Canada, through CANDU system, has shown some leadership. But so I agree that there is a real potential for nuclear power, particularly in fast-growing jurisdictions like China and India, or places like Saskatchewan, where you're literally on top of uranium fields. The issue, of course, that you're left with is the radioactive waste. Now, even there's innovation in that area too, because radioactive waste is really nothing more than wasted energy. So, there's colder kind of fission processes. There's the thorium type reactors coming on. I'm sure there's going to be innovation in the waste handling issue. But even more interesting is we're starting to see a crack in the so-called fusion game, whereas fission, you get energy by splitting the atom. Fusion, you get energy by bringing them together, like in the sun. And we had the first result coming out. I mean, an awful lot of energy was used, but an awful lot plus a little bit more was created. And that's actually very promising as well. So there's a lot of research going on in that. We've got a lot of Canadian innovation there. General Fusion, a DC-based company, is another one that's leading the way in that area. So we've got these are the technologies of tomorrow, and by pricing carbon, you're really giving them a little nudge forward to actually compete. People say, oh, we shouldn't give price carbon. It's outrageous the scale of the incentives we've given in terms of subsidies to that sector. Why wouldn't we want to claw back a little bit of the profits coming from, or a little bit of the cost associated with that? And to be blunt, I think your government deserves a lot of credit for actually being able to stand up and point out that this is a global issue. We have a duty and responsibility to future generations, and pricing carbon, like much of the world is doing already, is a necessary step to seed the innovation that will actually keep us leading in terms of the prosperity as we deal with global warming.
So I was in Saskatchewan. It's ironic because they are the fuel source for the nuclear industry. They don't have any nuclear power in Saskatchewan. They're still using coal.
It's unbelievable.
It's ironic, really. You know, and you're right about Ontario. I ask people regularly who are skeptical about nuclear power. I asked them how much of our electricity in Ontario, my lights just went on and off because of a dimmer, but how much of our electricity is fueled by nuclear power? Most people guess between 10 and 20% on the high end, when at a minimum every day it's 50%. I went to tour the Bruce facility last summer. They provide 1/3 of the power for Ontario alone. And I went to the facility there that where they store the waste, and it's not what you see on The Simpsons.
No.
But it was.
That's such a good analogy.
Well, it's true though. I mean, people think of nuclear waste, they think of a bucket of green slime falling over something. We went into this facility. It was about the size of, I would say, 3 hockey rinks, the surface area of 3 or 4 hockey rinks, and it had 50 years of high-level waste stored safely. They showed us the readings and the monitors. It was, you could probably get more negative impact using your cell phone, probably. But I mean, I'm kidding, of course. But the point is, if people saw this, it would dispel so many of the myths, and that's a big part of the nuclear issue. I used to be the chair of the Natural Resources Committee here for about 6 years, and whenever we were talking nuclear, one thing that stuck with me too was that the people who work in the industry say the people who are mostly pro-nuclear are people who work in the sector or live near a nuclear facility because they understand it, whereas the rest of the world has this fear based on the examples you gave earlier. So part of the challenge on that front is myth busting, and we have to get the word out, which is why we went out to Saskatchewan and why we're big advocates here in Ontario. We wouldn't have got off coal in Ontario if it wasn't for nuclear power.
I completely agree. And well, look at France. 75% of their power is nuclear as well. And the whole culture in France is one of acceptance of nuclear power. It's a very different culture. It's not perceived as to be this big threat. It's perceived to be how their society functions, and they take steps to ensure that the waste is stored properly. Again, there's innovation there that can actually, it's good to continue the pressure on, we don't want to just throw that waste around, keep the pressure on that we have to do something about it. Well, I'm sure there's lots of smart people around here who can find out innovative ways of burning that energy down even more. And I'm sure that's going to happen in the decade ahead.
I've talked to some people, and you'd know far more about this than I do, who suggest to me that traditional nuclear waste, if I can put it that way, is actually a potential fuel source for evolving a newer nuclear technology. And if that's the case,
yes, I agree.
That's a huge positive. I mean,
exactly.
it solves solves 2 problems at the same time.
You still have waste after using the waste, but it's not as radioactive. So it'll be interesting to see where that emerges. So I've heard that as well. And so that's where, when you start to price emissions, you start to recognize people are looking for alternatives. The R&D sector starts saying, okay, that's old. The government's now signaled out, as they have around the world, that we're moving away from this kind of carbon, burning coal to generate electricity. I mean, it's the most inefficient way of generating electricity you could possibly imagine. Well, burning peat is less efficient. And so, it starts to innovate in terms of finding solutions. And humans have a long track record of being really good at that. And all it needs is a little nudge. And you can see that in other areas of what we're doing. And I come back to the electric vehicle. I'm in BC, right? So all we needed in BC was that little nudge, that little zero emission vehicle policy, kickstart the electric vehicle sector here. And now, if you're driving around where I live in Victoria, the electric vehicle is one of the more common cars, right? So we have 15% of new vehicles, or I don't know what it is this year, but it was, being electric. And people, you just can't get them because there's so much demand.
Yeah,
And
well, that's another part of the problem. Yeah.
yeah, that's supply chain issues.
So
So,
there's a
but you'll be
question.
building them in Ontario, which is
We
exciting. The
will be building
Volkswagen,
lots
yeah,
of them in Ontario and
I
batteries
know.
too. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's our minister has been out working incredibly hard trying to bring in
Yeah, I was
investment.
trying to get that out into BC, right? Because we have got that rail line from
Yeah.
from Prince Rupert, the gateway to Asia, all the way to Chicago through Terrace. I mean, we'd have great manufacturing powered with clean energy in the northeast part of BC
No,
that
of
would be
course.
on that railway. But
Well,
it's,
Volkswagen just made a major announcement, a
I
major
know,
investment in Canada, first time in the history of our country, which is
I
fantastic.
know.
Minister
It's
Champagne
exactly.
is out there hustling, and he's doing a fabulous
Yeah,
job.
yeah.
Here's a question from somebody who's watching us online. Great question. So is Canada moving towards having more SMRs, and do you think the risk of a meltdown with the power plant in Ukraine has led people to be more suspicious of the growth of nuclear energy? And that's an excellent question because, as you said earlier, the skeptics out there think of the nuclear, the Chernobyls, and they're concerned. They see what's going on in Ukraine, and the people who are naysayers use that as another reason why we shouldn't move to nuclear power. But
Okay,
let's
first,
talk about
yeah.
that and the SMRs. Yeah.
Okay, first off, I mean, SMR, it's jargon, so I guess other viewers would probably want to know what that means. These are
Right.
small, I mean, we're
Small
talking about
modular
small
reactor.
modular
Right.
reactors, right? So these are,
Yeah.
I'm not an expert in that, but I do know that there's a lot of R&D going in that area. I suspect we may see that emerging more and more. The big one is the fear of Chernobyl or the Zaporizhia nuclear plant. Now, these first off are old Cold War era nuclear plants, right? They're not
Right.
modern
Right.
technology. So the modern technologies can't do the meltdown. These are old things from way back when. Nobody would build a Zaporizhia nuclear plant today. Nobody would build a Chernobyl today. And so really it's like comparing a not quite as bad, but a Roman aqueduct to a modern kind of pipe system for water flow in a city. Like
Right.
you could say, I don't want the aqueduct. Well, no one would build an aqueduct today. So while there are issues with some of the older plants, which can have meltdowns, the newer technology is very different. And the example I like to use, I don't want to become a spokesperson only for the nuclear industry, but let's look at Fukushima. Literally the worst possible accident you could imagine. A pipeline meltdown of a couple of reactors. Really, the worst possible reactors. I mean, it's tragic what happened there, but in the big picture, compared to other disasters like a hydro dam breaking, human loss of life was, I don't even know if there was any. It was minimal, and whereas we see accidents all the time. So I worry that out of the fear of the impossible, we are actually turning away the possible, right? So the possible is the elimination of emissions from coal-fired electricity immediately, or not, or very rapidly in places like Saskatchewan, China, and India through the creation of more distributed renewable energy and perhaps a couple of nuclear plants in the short term to stabilize the level of any intermittency that might exist. Okay, so that is possible today. If you're going to say no to nuclear, and you're going to say no to windmills in your backyard, as people do,
Mm-hmm.
what you're saying is yes to increasing global warming. And what you're essentially saying is you don't care about future generations, because literally that's what's on the table. And the key thing here is the decision makers of today won't have to live the consequences of the decisions they make or don't make, because as we put in place policy measures today, they play out in the climate system in the decades ahead. So by even if we, and so this is why it's critical to act now, and why governments and political that show that leadership now should be rewarded to deliver into what they promised to do, because there's nothing sexy about putting in carbon pricing, right? Like what you're doing is you're acting responsibly for future generations. And in doing so, one just has to remember that there are those in our society who are vulnerable, and we have to protect them as we move forward. And I think your plan is doing that with the fee and dividend approach. So for those people like to complain, I will say, and I feel confident in saying this, the present climate plan that the federal government have, and I'm very aware of the BC plan, if these are implemented, they're some of the most exciting plans anywhere on the earth. We don't need more policy. We've got them on the table. What we need to is implement it. So we need Canada to be no more coal by 2030. None of this discussion about suddenly, oh, well, we're going to go talk about clean coal. No, Canada's committed to no coal by 2030. Let's do it. Let's also commit, make sure that we're no longer allowing the US to ship their Powder Basin thermal coal through our ports after Washington, Oregon, California have all said no. BC says, oh, it's bringing in where we are. Canada's made some profound statements about thermal coal going through its ports. There's the key here is actually to deliver in the policy. And what concerns me most right now is not the fact that we don't have the policy. It's that those people who have brought it in need the support to help deliver that policy. Because I can tell anyone listening to this that if Mr. Poilievre has his way, you might as well give up on climate policy in Canada. And we'll be back to the Luddites on the international stage that we were and were considered for many years under Mr. Harper's leadership. And I don't think Canadians want that. So, we've got a good plan on the table. I think we need to make sure that it's implemented. Sure, we need to hold government to account, but rather than just only criticize, we also have to say what we want as well and how we can advocate for that. And that is, part of the problem I see with the discourse right now in climate policy is it's, people shouting at the clouds demanding perfection, recognizing that when you demand perfection, progress in climate policy is the casualty, and not supporting
That's a big problem, because you get these naysayers again saying, emissions aren't going down as fast as you promised. So therefore, the conclusion they expect you to draw from that is, well, then you do nothing. And of course, that's not the answer. I mean, it's foolish. It's foolish. I roll my eyes when I hear that argument. And it really bothers me to no end. So that last question was from Jenna, and I want to thank her for that. We've got one more question, Jenna. And I'm conscious of the time because I know both of us have another commitment very shortly. So let's take this question, and then maybe we can wrap up. Because what are the sectors where Canada is in a good position to be a leader in the climate action economy?
Okay, Canada, in terms of water issues, water and agricultural. So there's a lot of work being done in the agricultural sector about farming practices in terms of how changing farming practices can actually use land as a natural carbon sink. There's a ton there. We've got a lot of innovation that's happening in water. Now, water. When I say water is a big issue moving forward. Not so much for Canada; we're going to get lots of it, but places like the U.S., southern U.S., sub-Saharan Africa, the innovation in freshwater and reclamation of water is important. Canada's playing a role in that. Innovation in general, the nuclear sector, innovation in the renewable sector, we had a lot of leadership in solar power in Canada. Unfortunately, those companies were largely bought up and shipped to Europe. We can reclaim some of that. And one of the things we tried to do here in BC, which I think I see Canada doing too, was ensuring that we have enough capital available for Canadian innovation to get past the so-called valley of death. That is, we know that Canadians are really good at innovating, and they're really good at working at the lab bench, and they're really good at getting that first widget developed. And then everybody wants it. And then what happens is either they collapse or they move to the US. So having the ability to keep these kind of clean tech companies in Canada is important as well, because I'm not going to be able to predict, and no politician will be able to predict what a winning technology will be. But when you create the environment to allow innovation to thrive, which is what we're seeing now with the most recent budget, that in fact there will be successes, and you'll just let them emerge. But you've created the ecosystem to allow this creativity and innovation to flourish. So that's what's happening in Canada now. We'll see the fruits of that in a few years, and I just hope that we continue down this pathway of emissions reductions, which is the pathway we're currently on.
All right, we've incited an onslaught of questions here, Andrew. So I'm gonna do this real quick. There's two more. I'm gonna ask them at the same time, and then maybe we can wrap up there. So the first one is from Marcello. It says, given current technology, is it possible to attain net zero by 2050 if vehicles are still on the road? And then the second question from my friend Ruth, at the risk of being unpopular, I really wonder if anyone is looking at conservation. And then she uses the example of the water, the water shortages you're seeing in Arizona and California and whatnot.
So, the first question about net zero, to be perfectly blunt, I don't pay much attention to anyone making any pronouncement about 2050, because as soon as those words come out of their mouth, and that's with respect to your government too, who've made,
Yeah.
and we did it in BC, you can instantly say that nobody who's making those pronouncements will be around to be held accountable for those pronouncements. So they're worth as much as, this scrap piece of paper on my desk. So what matters is the actions that are happening today. And so, do I think we can get to carbon neutrality in the energy sector? Yes, I do. Do I think we can get to carbon neutrality overall by 2050? No, I don't. Do I think that means game over? No, I don't. So what I think we need to frame is the whole discussion away from this, we have to keep warming below some magical number. Because there's no science behind any of those magical numbers. They're just like, why 1.5 degrees as opposed to 1.536297, right?
Right.
And so what we need to be focused on is that every 1/10 of a degree warming we're able to mitigate against is a good thing. And that's the pathway that gets us off thinking 2050 to what can we do today. So I didn't really answer the question because I don't like talking about 2050, because we need to turn the corner and it'll take care of itself, just like electric vehicles or take care of themselves. Once you pass, you get to a tipping point where it now becomes a social norm, as it is in Victoria, to drive an electric car. You're not looked upon very fondly in Victoria if you drive a V12, right? You were judged harshly.
Everybody knows that guy.
Yeah, exactly. You don't drive a Hummer in Victoria, right? No, you just don't do it. So anyway, we even had people vandalizing SUVs. It's crazy. But to the other question about conservation by itself probably isn't going to cut it, because like I look at these ridiculous cities. I mean, they're not ridiculous, but I look at the Phoenix, Arizonas and the Southern Californians, and I look at climate projections, and you ask where they're getting water from, and you realize that the Colorado River is not going to supply it, and you realize that the Great High Plains Aquifer is being drained at something like 30 times faster than the rate it's being replenished. So there are really serious water shortage issues that will be emerging in the southern US. From my perspective, this is going to be viewed as controversial. I actually think we should start conversations now about water conservation and water transport. I actually truly believe that 50 years from now, the US will come knocking on our door and ask those oil pipelines to be converted to water pipelines.
Yeah, that's
but it's a really prickly issue, and the question is, do you want to wait till they come knocking on our door, or do we start the conversation now on our terms? I don't know. I mean, it's a very prickly, and I'm not trying to get the federal
Andrew, that might be a good place to stop. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not trying to get multinational water issues, but it's a very serious issue. That the question, I think, was it Ruth who raised it? Yeah, very serious issue, and I do think that we're going to have those conversations, and rather than just throwing up our hands and saying, oh no, let's just think about this carefully. And what does this mean? Because Canada's going to get a ton of water. Southern US is going to have increased drought.
Oh, the Great
Problems
Lakes
of the future.
Yeah, no, that future's coming, and it's coming quickly. So you're absolutely right to talk about that. Look, time went by way too quickly. There's a whole variety of things we could have explored further, and maybe that's be a good reason to do this again, which is my way of saying I'd love to have you back some other time to to continue our discussion. But for now, I just want to say thank you. That was very, very informative, very helpful, and very practical too, I might add.
I thoroughly enjoyed it. So yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not your typical academic, right?
No, no, I enjoyed listening to you, and I was never a good student. So there you go. That's the greatest compliment I can
Oh,
pay you.
I've got lots of bruises from sitting on the other side in question period over in the legislature here too. So I've been in that battlefield as well.
I'm sure you did. Well, listen,
All
I
right,
can't thank you enough, and I look forward to seeing you sometime in person. I know you got to get off to another meeting, and I'm serious. I'd love to continue this another time.
fantastic. Thank you.
All right, Andrew, take care.
Bye bye.